Midnight bells. Snow falling sideways across a chapel door that has not opened in 80 years. Inside the door, a man who is not a man, Lukasz Varga, 421 years old, listens. He hears something he should not hear. A breath. Small. Stuttering. Barely longer than a moth's wing. He sets down the silver crucifix he was polishing out of habit, never out of fear, and walks the long stone hall with the slow patience of a tide. He opens the chapel door. The wind hits him full in the chest, carrying with it the smell of pine and iron. There on the worn step lies a bundle of burlap. Inside the burlap, a face the size of an apple. 3 days old. Frost on her eyelashes. Lukasz kneels. 2 fingers brush her cheek, and something inside his chest, silent for 2 centuries, clenches like a fist closing on a coin. Who left her here? And why tonight of all nights, the longest night in Bohemia? Stay with me. The castle stood on a black tooth of rock above the village of Hrosnov, in the Carpathian foothills, and in the winter of 1789 it had not seen a guest in 19 years. The villagers below crossed themselves whenever they passed the long road that climbed toward its gate, and they told their children the road was a tongue and the castle was a mouth, and the mouth did not chew, it only swallowed. They were not wrong about the mouth. They were wrong about the chewing. The road itself was lined with old crooked pines, each one wider at the base than a man is tall, each one bent the same direction by a wind that had been blowing the same way for 600 years. 2 stone wolves sat at the gate mossed over, their snouts worn smooth by weather. The drawbridge had not been raised in a century. The portcullis had not been lowered in 2. The castle did not need walls anymore. Its name was its wall. Lukasz Varga had not fed on a human being in 80 winters. He had taken the blood oath in the year his wife, Eleonora, died of a fever he could not bite away, for he had sworn to her on her last night that he would not turn her, not even to keep her, because she had said, with her hand on his face, that to live forever as a thing that drinks the living would be to lose her twice. He had kept that oath. He drank from animals brought up from the lower farms. He drank from the deer the foresters left dressed in the snow. He drank, and he ate nothing else, and he had grown thinner across the centuries, the way a knife grows thinner across the years on the whetstone. He was head of the Carpathian coven by inheritance and by silence. He spoke when he needed to. He listened more than he spoke. Now here's the thing. A vampire who does not feed becomes a kind of priest. He keeps a discipline the others do not understand, and they fear him for it, and they obey him for it, and they hate him for it in a quiet, careful way. The coven hall in the east wing of the castle had a long oak table, 12 chairs, and a fire that never warmed the room. At that table sat the elders Margit of Brno, who remembered the Hussite wars, Bodin the Quiet, who had walked across the Vltava the night it froze in 1412, Anjka with her gray braid down her back, and Cyprian, Lukasz's nephew, 200 years younger than his uncle, sharp-faced, sharp-tongued, a man who wore velvet the way other men wore armor. Cyprian had not taken the oath. Cyprian fed when he wanted, where he wanted, and the village below had begun to whisper in the past spring of a peasant girl named Jirina who had vanished, and of another, a miller's daughter, who had come home pale and shaking and could not say where she had been. Lukasz had reprimanded his nephew once, in private, and Cyprian had laughed, and the matter had been closed in the way matters in old families are closed, with a held breath and a long look. The chapel where the newborn had been left was the smallest building on the castle grounds. It sat behind the keep, attached to the curtain wall, and it had been Eleonora's chapel. She had prayed there in the evenings when she was still alive, before the fever, and after she died, Lukasz had locked the door with a key he wore on a leather cord at his throat. The key had not turned for 80 winters. He had walked past it 10,000 times. He had not opened it once. He opened it tonight only because he had heard the breath. The breath had been louder than 80 years of silence. Believe me. He carried the bundle into the keep. He did not run. He had not run in 300 years. The keep itself was a tall, narrow tower of gray stone, its windows small and high, its inner stairs worn into shallow bowls at the center of every step by the feet of 3 centuries of Vargas. The torches in the brackets along the wall burned low and blue, the way torches burn when the air is thin with frost. The flagstones beneath his boots gave back the sound of his footsteps, the way the inside of a well gives back the sound of a coin. He walked with the burlap pressed to his chest, the way a farmer carries a lamb that has been pulled from a ditch, and the infant inside the burlap made a small wet sound and turned her face toward the cloth of his coat. The wool of his coat was black. Her cheek against it looked like the moon against a chimney. Lukash stopped once in the long corridor and looked down at her. He had been a father briefly, 400 years ago, a son born in 1568, dead at 7 of plague. He had not held a child since. His hands remembered the shape before his mind caught up. The infant opened her eyes. They were gray. They focused on his face, and they did not flinch. He did not know then why that mattered to him. He would know later. He would know within the hour. He pushed open the doors of the coven hall with his shoulder, because his hands were full. The 4 elders looked up. Margit's eyes went to the bundle, and then to his face, and then back to the bundle. Bowden said nothing. Bowden said nothing about most things. Anjka rose slowly, her braids swinging. And Cyprian, sitting at the far end of the table with a glass of dark wine in his hand, Cyprian went still. Not surprised still. Not curious still. A different kind of still. The kind a man goes when he sees the noose in another man's hand and recognizes the knot. Lukash laid the bundle on the table between the candles. He pulled back the burlap. The infant blinked at the candlelight. She did not cry. She made a small noise, like a kitten swallowing, and turned her head toward the warmth. Margit said quietly, Lukash. You cannot, Anjka said, it is mortal taint. It is the law, Bowden said nothing. Cyprian said very fast, put it back outside. Lukash lifted his head. He looked at his nephew across the long table. He did not say anything. He looked. Cyprian's hand tightened on his glass. The wine inside the glass moved like an animal. Lukash said, in the voice that had once been used to put down a duke's rebellion without drawing a sword, who knew this child was coming to this door. The room did not answer. The fire in the hearth burned without warming. Anjka said again, it is the law, Lukash. A mortal infant in the castle. It cannot stay. Even if you could keep it, what would you do with it? Feed it. With what? We have nothing here for a thing that drinks milk and breathes. Lukash said, I will find it milk. I will find it breath. Margit said very gently, Lukash, my friend. She will die in a week. They die that fast, the small ones. You know this. You buried one once. Do not bury 2. Lukash closed his eyes. For 1 second, only one. He was 400 years younger and standing in a churchyard outside Edger with a wooden box no longer than his forearm in his hands. He opened his eyes. He said, I will not put her outside. Cyprian stood. He said, Uncle. With respect. The coven cannot harbor. Lukash looked at him again. He saw this time what he had not seen the first time. He saw the small white scar on his nephew's lip that Jirina, the miller's daughter, had given Cyprian when she had bitten him on the mouth in a kitchen last spring before she vanished. He saw the way Cyprian's eyes went to the burlap and then away from it, the way a man's eyes go to and away from a debt he is trying not to count. He saw the signet ring on his nephew's right hand, a small wolf's head engraved with the Varga sigil, the ring every male of the line was given on his 40th year. He saw all of this in the space of one heartbeat, the infant made against the table. And he knew. He did not say it. He did not even allow it to cross his face. He only said very quietly, "The matter will be decided. Tonight the child will be warmed. Tonight the child will be fed. I will not have her death added to whatever else has happened in this house." He picked up the bundle again. He walked out of the coven hall. He did not look at Cyprian. The door closed behind him, with the soft, final sound of a coffin being lowered. He carried the child down the back stair into the kitchens, where Babuna, 60 years old, broad-shouldered, the only human who had served in the castle for 40 years and outlived 3 rounds of suspicion, was banking the night fire. Babuna looked up. Her eyes went round. Lukash said, "Babuna, I need warm milk. I need a wet cloth. I need a basket lined with the fleece from the south barn. And I need your silence for one night, even from God." Babuna crossed herself. Then she did exactly what he asked. Lukash set the bundle on the long kitchen table. He watched Babuna's hands, slow and certain, take the burlap away. He watched the baby's small naked body in the candlelight. He counted 10 toes. He counted 10 fingers. He saw, on the inside of the baby's left ankle, a birthmark shaped like a small dark crescent. Cyprian had the same mark in the same place from the same line. The coven thought that night that the matter had been dropped. They were wrong. He went to his chamber. He sat in the chair by the window and did not light a candle. He watched the snow fall on the chapel roof for 3 hours. He did not move. He thought of Eleonora. He thought of his son. He thought of Jirina, the miller's daughter, who had not come home and would not. He thought of the way his nephew had said, "Put it back outside." He did not weep, because he had not wept in 200 years, but the muscles in his face moved the way they had once moved when weeping had been possible, and that was a kind of weeping too. At dawn, which is to say, the hour when most of his kind go to sleep, he heard a soft knock. He opened the door. Babuna stood there. In her hand she held a torn piece of the burlap the baby had been wrapped in. She held it out. Lukash took it. Pressed into the mud caked on one corner of the cloth was the perfect, clear impression of a signet ring. A small wolf's head. The Varga sigil. Babuna said nothing. Lukash said nothing. He folded the burlap into a small square. He put it in the inside pocket of his coat, against the place where his heart no longer beat but had last night clenched. He said, "Babuna." "The child sleeps," Babuna said. "She sleeps." She took the milk. "She is warm," Lukash said. "Her name." "Did her mother give her a name?" Babuna said. There was nothing in the cloth. No paper. No prayer. Only a small wooden bead on a thread around her neck. With the letter M scratched on it, Lukash closed his eyes. He said, "Marta. We will call her Marta." "It was my mother's name." Babuna nodded and went back to the kitchen. Lukash stood in the open door of his chamber for a long minute. Then he closed the door and went to the chapel for the first time in 80 years. He unlocked it. He went inside. The dust was thick and the air was cold, and the small wooden Christ above the altar was missing one arm. He knelt on the stone where Eleonora had once knelt. He put his forehead against the stone. He stayed there until the bells in the village below struck noon. Then he stood up. He walked back across the courtyard. He went to the coven hall. He stood at the head of the long oak table. The elders were not yet awake. It was day, but Cyprian, who slept lightly when he had reason to, came down within the hour. Lukash was still standing at the head of the table when his nephew came in. The other elders trickled in behind. Margit, Ainjka, Bowden. They sat. They waited. The room smelled of cold wax and old wood. Lukash took out the folded burlap. He laid it on the table. He did not unfold it. He said in a voice that did not rise, "I claim this child as mine. From this dusk forward, she belongs to my house. She is under my name. She is under my blood. By blood oath, I swear before this coven, anyone who harms her, anyone who lifts a hand toward her, anyone who whispers her death in a corner, even a member of my own line, even a man at this table will answer to me." In the chapel, at the altar, with no second word spoken and no second chance given, the fire in the hearth made one small sound. Margit slowly lowered her eyes. Anjka set both her hands flat on the table. Bowden, who had not spoken in 3 hours, said only, "So be it." Cyprian sat very still. His face was the color of paper that had been held too close to a candle. He said, "Uncle, you would threaten your own blood. For a peasant, for a foundling, over an oath made on a doorstep." Lukash said, "I would threaten anything that has ever drawn breath. I would threaten the dawn itself. Do not test me, nephew. I have not fed on a man in 80 years. Do not be the man I feed on." He picked up the burlap. He folded it again. He left the hall. Behind him, no one spoke for a long time. The coven thought the matter was settled. The coven was again wrong. A week passed. The baby Marta grew, in the slow, careful way that newborns grow by ounces. Babuna slept in the kitchen with a basket beside her. The castle kept its winter quiet. The snow on the chapel roof grew 6 inches deep, and then froze hard and shone in the morning sun. Lukash walked the corridors at night and stopped every hour at the kitchen door and looked in and walked on. He did not hold the child. He did not yet know if his hands, which had not held a living warm thing in centuries, would remember. He waited. On the 7th night, a clear night, the moon almost full, the kind of night his kind call a bone moon, Lukash sat in his chamber and felt, the way an old soldier feels whether in his shoulder, the wrong shape of the air. He stood. He went out into the corridor. He did not run. He walked fast. He went down the back stair into the kitchen. Babuna was asleep in her chair by the fire. The basket beside her was empty. The window above the basket was open. The cold air was moving the curtain. The candle on the table had been blown out. Lukash did not waken Babuna. He turned. He went up the stair, through the long corridor across the courtyard into the chapel. The chapel door was already open. Inside, by the altar, Cyprian stood with the bundle in his left arm and a thin curved knife in his right hand. He was not yet doing anything with the knife. He was looking down at the baby in the candlelight. His face was twisted in something that was almost grief and almost not. He looked up when Lukash came in. He said very fast, "Uncle, please, you don't understand. This child, if the village ever learns, if the coven below ever learns whose blood she carries, they will come for us. All of us. They will come for you. I am saving the house." Lukash walked forward. He did not draw a weapon. He had not carried a weapon in 80 years. He walked until he stood between his nephew and the cradle stone, where the bundle had been laid the first night. Then he stopped. He said, "Put down the knife, Cyprian." Cyprian said, "Move." Lukash said, "No." Cyprian said, "Uncle, I will use it." Lukash said very quietly, "Then use it. Use it on me. But you will go through me. And when you do, every elder in this house will know what you did in a kitchen last spring with a miller's daughter, and what you did in a barn 9 months ago with a peasant girl named. Yes, I know her name. I have known it since the burlap, and what you tried to do tonight in your uncle's chapel, on your uncle's altar, with your uncle's knife. You will use it on me, nephew. And the house will judge you. Not for the child. For the lie, Cyprian's hand shook. The knife shook. The baby in his other arm made a small wet sound. Cyprian looked down at her. He looked at her face. He had not, Lukash realized, looked at her face until that moment. He had been a man holding an object. He was now a man holding a daughter. His daughter. His hand opened. The knife fell on the stone with a small, bright sound. Cyprian sank to one knee. He held the baby out toward Lukash the way a man hands over a sword in surrender. Lukash took her. He held her against his chest. He held her there for 1 second, then 2, then 5. He felt her warmth through his coat. He felt the small breath at his collar. Something in him that had been folded up since 1575 unfolded one crease. He did not let it unfold further. Not yet. He looked down at his nephew. He said, "Stand up." Cyprian stood. Lukash said, "Walk." They walked out of the chapel together. They walked across the courtyard. They walked into the coven hall, where the other 3 elders, summoned by the sound of the chapel door, were already waiting. Lukash laid the baby in Margit's lap. Margit, who had not held a child in 300 years, and who, when the bundle touched her, made a small sound she had not made in 300 years either. Then Lukash turned to his nephew. He said in front of all of them, "Cyprian Varga, by the oath I swore in this hall 1 week ago, and by the blood we share, I name you exile of this coven. For 100 years from this dusk, you will not set foot in this castle. You will not enter any house of our line. You will not feed on any human in Bohemia, Moravia, Hungary, or the lands of the Carpathians. If you are seen, you will be hunted. If you are hunted, you will be ended. Do you understand me?" Cyprian looked at the floor. He said, "I understand." Lukash said, "Then go. Now. Tonight." Before dawn, Cyprian walked to the door. At the door he stopped. He said without turning, "Uncle." "The child." What is her name?" Lukash said, "Marta." "Her name is Marta. She is my daughter. And she will never know yours." Cyprian's shoulders fell, the way a roof falls when the snow becomes finally too much. He stood there one long moment with his hand on the iron ring of the door. He did not turn around. He said very quietly, almost to the wood itself, "Then keep her safe, uncle." "Keep her safer than I was kept." Lukash did not answer. Cyprian opened the door. He walked out into the long corridor and down the back stair, and across the inner courtyard and out through the small east postern, the one the foresters used at dawn. The guards on the wall watched him go. None of them stopped him. None of them spoke. The snow fell on his black coat and on his black hair, and within an hour the road below had taken him, and the trees on the road had closed behind him. The door closed. The fire made one small sound. Margit looked up from the bundle in her lap. She said very softly, "Lukash." "The law," Lukash said, "the law was written by men who never opened a chapel door at midnight on the longest night of the year. The law will be amended," Anchka said slowly, "by a vote of this house." Lukash said, "Then vote." They voted. Hands went up around the long table, Margit's, Anchka's, Boden's, one by one, slow and certain, like the tolling of a bell. The law was amended that night. The chapel that had been closed for 80 years was reopened, formally, and Babuna, who had served the castle for 40 years and outlived 3 rounds of suspicion, was named wet nurse and given the small room at the foot of the chapel stair so she could be near the cradle. Marta slept that night in a basket beneath the small one-armed Christ. Lukash sat in the chapel chair by the basket and did not move until dawn. He did not pray. He had not prayed in a long time. He only watched her breathe. 18 winters passed. The castle changed, in small ways, the way a man's face changes from one decade to the next. You do not see it in the mirror, but old friends see it when they come. Marta grew. Marta walked. Marta spoke. Marta read. By her 10th winter she had read every book in the lower library, 3,000 of them, in 7 languages, and Lukasz had begun to bring books up from Prague by carriage in the spring thaws, 20 crates at a time, so she would not run out. By her 14th winter she had asked to learn medicine, and Lukasz had sent for a physician from Vienna, a quiet old man named Dr. Reinhardt, who came up the long road 3 times a year and stayed for 2 months at a time and taught her anatomy, the use of herbs, the binding of wounds, the listening to the chest, the watching of the eye. Marta took to it the way a fish takes to water and then to the deep. Babuna grew old. Babuna's hair went white. Babuna's hands went thin. Marta, at 16, began to nurse Babuna in the small room at the foot of the chapel stair, and when Babuna died one spring morning with her hand in Marta's hand, Marta closed her eyes and said the prayer in Czech that Babuna had taught her, and Lukasz stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. The coven held. Margit Anjka, Bowden, they had grown in 18 years into a kind of strange aunts and uncle to the girl. Margit braided Marta's hair on feast days. Anjka taught her to ride. Bowden, who still spoke rarely, taught her to be quiet in a forest, which is the hardest thing a person can be taught. Cyprian was never spoken of. Cyprian was somewhere in the long countries to the south. Lukasz had received word of him in Trieste once, in Salonika once, in Constantinople once, and Cyprian had not crossed the border back into the Carpathians. He never would. The 100 years were not yet finished. He was still alive. He was still away. Lukasz had broken his oath only once in those 18 winters. The fever came on Marta in her 13th year, the same fever that had taken Eleonora, and for 9 days and 9 nights she burned, and for 9 days and 9 nights Lukasz did not leave her room. On the 7th day Dr. Reinhardt told him quietly in the corridor that he himself was failing. He had not slept in 4 days. He had given everything he had. His hands shook now when he held the cup, and that if Lukasz wished to save his daughter, Lukasz had better find within himself whatever a father finds when a doctor cannot find it anymore. Lukasz went into his chamber. He looked at the silver crucifix on his shelf. He thought of Eleonora's last night, and the oath he had made beside her bed. He thought of Marta, 3 days old on a chapel step, with frost on her eyelashes. He went down to the lower farm. He drank from a deer the foresters had dressed. He drank as much as he could hold, enough to stay alive, enough to stand, enough to sit by his daughter's bed for the next 70 hours without falling. He drank only that. He did not bite the forester. He did not bite the cook. He did not, even in the dark of his hunger, look toward the village. He sat by Marta's bed. He held her hand. On the 9th night the fever broke. She opened her eyes. She said, "Father," he said, "daughter." That was the only time he had bent the oath. He had bent it for her. He counted it quietly against his soul every night for the next 5 years, and he decided every night that he would bend it again if he had to, and every night he was grateful that he had not had to. The chapel stayed open. The chapel was now Marta's. She kept it. She swept it on Saturdays. She lit the candles on Sundays. She read in it on long afternoons when the light came through the high small window and made a square on the stone floor. She would sit inside like a cat sits inside a square of sun. On the night before her 18th birthday, which was, by the calendar Lukasz had kept since the first night, the same night, the longest night, the 1789th and 18th winter, Marta walked across the courtyard alone. The snow was falling. The chapel door stood open behind her. She had been inside reading. She turned in the doorway and looked out at the courtyard, and she saw on the chapel step a small dark shape. She walked toward it. She knelt. It was a bird. A small gray thrush, the kind that nests in the eaves of the chapel in summer. Frozen. Already gone. She picked it up gently. She held it in both her hands. She knew, the way her father had taught her without ever saying it, that some things you find on a step in winter, you do not leave on the step. You carry them in. You give them a name, even if the name is only this one. You make sure the cold does not have the last word. She stood. She looked up across the courtyard, and through the window of the keep she could see her father, standing in his chamber, watching her. He raised a hand. She raised a hand. She turned. She walked back into the chapel. She closed the door from the inside. Lukasz stood at his window a long time. He had not felt his pulse in 80 years. A frozen child had found it. A vow had remade a house. The snow kept falling on the chapel roof. The bells in the village below struck midnight. The longest night ended, the way every longest night ends, with a slow turning toward the light.